that happened in a place where I once lived. And in that place, I got to know some wonderful people who loved God and did some simple but great things in a town. But before we go any further, I actually want to take away a look at a completely different scripture in Haggai chapter 1. Can we just have that up there? And the reason I'm going back here is to build a bit of a picture so we can have a comparison about when something doesn't happen or when God tells some people that they really need to do something, as opposed to when some people hear from God and say, hey, I'm going to get on board with this. So here we had a situation, and God spoke to Haggai. Let's just flip through next verse, next one. The church, or the building that they used to gather together to worship God, was in ruin. Next slide. And the people didn't care about it. It didn't bother them. Next slide. They were more concerned about their own places. They were more concerned about where they lived, the flash houses, the beautiful decor, everything like that. And meanwhile, God's temple lay in ruin. And so the word from the Lord was to be careful and to consider be careful. Give careful thought to your words. You have planted much and harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. Next slide, please. You earn wages only to put them on and in a purse with holes in it. Next slide. Again, the Lord's reminding them, give careful thought to their ways. Next slide. We might have missed a verse. Can we just go back a bit? Next. Yeah, we probably have. We have. But that's okay. There's a verse in verse 9. Let's go to verse 9. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. So these people were living a life. Meanwhile, God's temple lay in ruin. They were more concerned about themselves. But yet, no matter what they did, no matter how they strived, no matter what they planted, God blew it all away, and they just continued to strive and strive. This was a word to these people to wake up, to hear what God was saying, and to act. But they didn't. God had to really do a work in their lives. Let's go to the next slide. Complete next slide, thank you. The next scripture. Thank you. Our scripture today is, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. So often when we think of sending, we get this picture and we think, it's someone and they're going off to do mission. They're going overseas or they're going away to another part to go and do something and work with people in that community. The story I'm going to tell you today is about a group of people who at the time, they didn't know each other. They all got to know each other. Some of them never really met everyone, but effectively, I found myself in a place where I was kind of in the middle of this. And so I got to hear the stories, and I got to see some of the stories myself. And I referred to the place where the story is as Main Town. And there are many stories that I could have added in to the message today, but we just wouldn't have enough time for them to happen. How do I know all these things happen? Well, I went and lived in that place. And I'm just so fortunate that the Lord allowed me to see what was happening and be part of what was happening. The difference between these people and the people in Haggai is that they just weren't content to just live in their panelled houses. And little did they know that they were being sent. Maintown had several churches. There was Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, some Pentecostal churches like Elam and AOG, and there was also Town Baptist. At that time, the most significant thing that happened amongst the churches is that every now and then some people in one church would move to another church, and it was reciprocal. So you would have people in another church who would move to another church, and it kind of became known as the church shuffle, and that was the event that occurred, and that was the only significant thing among the churches in Maintown that actually ever happened. But other than that, church life remained the same. People came and they gathered and they worshipped God, and they went off and into society and with work and everything that they did. There were activities in some of the churches as well that helped out in the community, and that was wonderful and great. But that was it. That was it. Of course, there was one other church in the area that no one in Maintown ever talked about, because it was in Town West. Very few people from Maintown would go to Town West. It was a neighbourhood that had everyday people in it, like you and I, but it also had people who, for them, life was hard. Some of them were poor. Others had families who were in gangs or in prison. Probably no different to parts of Whangarei today, to be honest. Town West had a couple of shops in it, a primary school, a local marae, and a little old Baptist church that had seen better days. No one gathered in that church. But God had better plans. He had plans, and just as in the book of Haggai, where the people were called to rebuild the temple, in this case, God was going to build something new that would also involve some of the people from the churches in Maintown. My journey for me began when I moved to Maintown. I'd been drawn there to relocate my accounting business. On my first Sunday, I decided to go to Town Baptist Church. Well, when I arrived, I was told by the welcomers on the door that they had a new pastor, and that new pastor would be starting in a couple of weeks. Now, the people there were friendly and welcoming, but as I entered the building, I couldn't help noticing there just seemed to be a lot of space in the auditorium. You know, the chairs were spread out wide. There were other chairs that were down the side of the aisle, stacked, or just lined up down the aisles. There was a stage, like we have a stage here, where the music team was on. But then it would be like coming, down a couple of rows down the front, there was a platform. And on that platform, there was a lectern, and that was where the speaker or the pastor spoke. So there was a lot of gaps and there was a lot of space in this church. My conclusion on the first Sunday is that this church must have been quite a big and full church at one time. A few weeks later, the new pastor arrived, and we'll call him Murray. He arrived, and over the next few months, the church began to grow. New people joined or returned. And the church began with home groups restarting and other activities that they had done in the past, started to gear up, and just normal church life started to occur. And for anyone who was coming in, who had seen the before where the auditorium had all these gaps and started to see there was less and less gaps, and suddenly the platform at the front of the stage disappeared. And the pastor would speak from this stage effectively. And so there began to be a sense that God was doing something in this church community. Now, I'd heard a rumour, after living there for a little while, that there was a food bank in the town. Now, it wasn't advertised anywhere, so I didn't really know who to contact or where to go to drop off some food. So as a Monday morning began after Sunday, I settled into working in my office. I had plenty to do and I had new clients to meet. By the time Wednesday came and the afternoon arrived, I got a phone call from Gary. Now I'd met Gary and his wife Mary at church on a couple of Sundays before, and it turned out that they were also my neighbours. They lived in my street. Gary was a pilot, and he said he frequently volunteered at the local food bank. Well, of course, alarm bells rang for me because I'd been trying to find out where this hidden food bank was, or how I could get involved. He asked if I was free that evening. I said yes, because I was curious. I wanted to know more about this food bank. And he said, "Oh, by the way, can you bring your station wagon? Oh, and do the doors, the doors on your station wagon, can you lock them easily from the inside?" "Yes," I said. "Yes, I can do that. Yeah. So we arranged a time, and I picked him up, and he gave me directions, and off we went. Now, funnily enough, we didn't go into the main town central area, because that's where I was expecting us to go. No, in fact, we headed off to Town West. I'd never been to Town West. I'd heard rumours about Town West. As we drove through, I thought, this is just a normal place. Houses, people living here. And eventually, we arrived at Town West Baptist. We pulled up outside, and it was an old rundown church building. We went inside, and in the back of the building, way out of sight, was the food bank. Gary and I filled the car, and then we drove off to deliver the food. Gary gave the directions. I drove. It was a really simple process. He'd hop out of the car, he'd grab a food parcel, I'd lock the doors, he'd go to the door, he'd deliver the food, he'd come back and I'd unlock the doors, he'd hop in. It was quite repetitive. And I began to think, why do we have to lock the doors all the time, But he'd said we did, so I thought we better. And so so we went to the first house, the second, we got to the third house. When we got to the third house, things were a little bit different. Gary got out, I locked the doors, he went in to knock on the door and deliver the food. And suddenly, it was like out of nowhere, the car was surrounded by all these children trying to break into the car. They were hungry. They were wanting food. Well, I didn't really know what to do. I was stunned. Gary came towards the car, and as he came, they ran away. That memory stuck with me for many years. I've lived in other places other than Maintown, but that memory has stuck with me for many years. Well, it's fair to say that after that experience, this food bank run became a regular event for Gary and I. He'd phone up, and the times would change, and the dates would change, but it was always the same routine. And sure enough, sometimes it wasn't house 3, maybe it was house 5 or 6, where suddenly the car was surrounded by kids. But it became a regular event for us. And through Gary and Mary, I got to know Tui. Now, Tui was a lady who lived in Town West. She was part of Town Baptist. You know, Tui must have had the biggest heart of anyone I ever met. She was always looking after other people. Tui longed for the day when Town Baptist would have church services again. Everywhere Tui went, people heard about Jesus. She was loved by the people of Town Baptist, by the people of Main Town, and by the people of Town West. Everyone loved her. She was highly respected in the community, and she was also involved in the local marae. Tui was a prayer warrior, and we used to have prayer meetings, and before long, the prayer room that we were using at Town Baptist was overflowing with people. So we raised some funds, and we raised some funds, and the church board, and Town Baptist Church bought an old classroom, and they put it on the property. And they got real fancy digital locks installed. So if you had the code, you could get in. And that meant that the prayer room could operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you think, oh, that's nice. Probably won't be used much, eh? But no. Didn't matter what time you went, what day of the week you went, there was always someone there praying. In fact, sometimes there were groups of people there praying. It was so well used. I remember going one night after midnight only to find several people there praying. Some of the residents of Town West, Main Town and Town West, worked at the largest employer in the area. And that business ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it meant that many of them were working shift work. One of them, Chris ran the men's ministry at the church. Well, couldn't really call it a men's ministry because there wasn't really a lot happening. You see, one of the biggest problems was that Chris, he worked shift work. So it was very hard for him to arrange events. And there wasn't really many men who were really interested in going to the events anyway. And so there were often times where I would meet up with Chris after he'd finished his shift and we would pray in the prayer room. Well, several days later, on one occasion, after spending some time with Chris in the prayer room and us praying, I got a phone call from Jim. Now, Jim had been working for an earth-moving company outside the district, and he worked in sales and he worked in hireage. And he decided that it was time for him to set up his own business. He wanted to be in control of his own time. Now, Chris went to Town Baptist, and he wanted to serve God in business and at church. So I contacted Greg. Greg was a local lawyer, and together we set up Jim's new company for him. And you never guess who the first employee was that Jim hired. It was Chris, who ran the men's ministry. Well, the other thing was, little did Jim know that at the time, but Main Town was going to have a building boom in a year's time. And he was going to have to hire more staff. Well, around this time, Greg the lawyer became the new prayer team leader at Town Baptist. And his wife, Sarah, she was now on the staff as well. But I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. It was about this time that I started to realise that just like a jigsaw puzzle, things were starting to come together and there was a picture that was starting to emerge. And over the next coming weeks, I worked with Greg and we set up several businesses from people who went to many of the churches in Maintown, all who had the same idea. We were going to go into business for ourselves so that we can contrive control of our time so that we can also serve the Lord. And that was the thinking, that was the reasons. We heard them in many different ways, but it was always the same thing that was being said. And so when you start to hear these things and you start to see these things, you think, things are starting to happen here. What has God got planned here? Well, one day, Chris, the ministry leader, he got a phone call from his friend Jake. Now, Jake, he worked in emergency services. And when he wasn't working in emergency services, he was building a mud brick house for his wife and his family. Now, Jake, he was on the edge of church life. And only occasionally did he ever go to a men's ministry event. And only occasionally did the men's ministry ever have an event. Well, while Jake was on a call out, he injured his leg. And that meant that he was off work for some time. Now, he could still get around on crutches, but it suddenly meant that progress on his mud brick house came to a bit of a standstill. Because he was actually building this himself. Now, Jake and his wife, it was spring, and Jake and his wife had spent winter in the caravan with their 3-year-old son. So they really didn't want to go through that experience again, but they were kind of in this hard situation. Well, Jake, he reached out. He reached out to Chris, who ran the men's ministry. And Chris put a call out to all the men at Town Baptist and some other guys who he knew from other churches and he knew from here, there and everywhere. And so what actually happened was that for several Saturdays, actually it was right through to Christmas, really, men would gather at Jake's place and they would help build the mud brick house. Jake gave the directions, and some of the guys turned up with barbecues, and there was plenty of food, there was always plenty of things happening, and so most Saturdays, a large group of men gathered together to help this guy, Jake, build his mud brick house. And sure enough, the house was built, got its signed off by council, and they moved in before Christmas. Jake and his wife Julie and their son were so overwhelmed at the support that they had received that they became part of the Town Baptist community. And through this experience, the men's ministry grew. And after the mud brick house, there were many other working bees as well as social occasions for the men's ministry. And at the end of the year, end of another year, I should say, Greg, who was leading the prayer ministry, he helped Chris organise the men's camp. I was on the organisation committee, and we had to find a campsite that would fit over 200 men. Greg's friend Sean, who'd previously spoken one Sunday at church, and he was involved in a ministry, and the easiest way to describe it is that he and his wife Eileen helped bring families and wider whānau together where there had been extremely deep and painful hurts. Needless to say, Sean's messages were very relevant, and many lives at that camp were touched, with some men making commitments to Christ and others promising to be better husbands and better dads. Interesting that some years later, Sean became a minister. Yet while good things were happening at Town Baptist and within the other churches in Maintown, because they continued to grow as well, Town West Baptist remained the same. It was empty. But then Sarah, who was on staff at Town Baptist, she had this idea. And she went and she saw the principal at Town West Primary. And she discovered that they were struggling to feed the children, because many of the children from Town West were coming to school hungry. There were no feeding programs. There was no government lunch programs there back then. So what happened? Sarah, along with Tui, who I'd mentioned earlier, who lived in Town West, and she was part of the marae. So they met with the school and they met with the marae and they initiated a school lunch program. It was the first church and community partnership in the main Town Baptist area. It took off. Things began to happen in Town West as a result of it. And it was just as well, because the food bank that they'd had at Town West had been forced to close because of lack of funds. And the manager had left town. After several years, Sarah and Greg both left their jobs. And with a team from Town Baptist, they began to live and work among the people of Town West. Today, in this community, there is the church community partnership with Town West Church and the Marae continues. The result is that many families now have better lives. There are school lunches, there's a food bank, and there's many other initiatives. And they now also provide scholarships for some of those children who want to go to university or get further education. Several other people at Town Baptist also went and sold their homes. And then they bought houses when had houses built when land became available, and they built houses in Town West. One such couple was Dale and Mary. They'd lived in the outback of Australia. It's a hard place. Dale was a motorbike mechanic, and Mary, she went and trained at Carey Baptist, and she became a prison chaplain. It was through prison chaplaincy that a man by the name of Bruno came to know the Lord. Bruno was the head of one of New Zealand's most notorious gangs before coming to help. Bruno was one of the most notorious gangs before he came to Christ. But after his conversion, Bruno left the gang life behind, and now with help from people like Dale and Mary, Greg and Sarah, and many others, He works to help people get out of the gangs and rebuild their lives, with so many coming to Christ. Paul, who I knew at the time, he now lives in Australia and he sells real estate. But back then he saw himself as a little bit of an evangelist on the side. And that's back when Sarah and Greg first started working with the people in Town West. Paul had decided that he was going to do a tour around New Zealand and go into some of the country towns. And he was going to go and he was going to bring a gospel message. He arrived one evening at Town West. And in a little old rundown Baptist church, which was so packed with people there was standing room only, he shared a simple gospel message. Paul talked about God and how in knowing God we could find acceptance, have acceptance and find purpose in our lives. When he finished his message, he saw the back of the wall move as two of the biggest men he had ever seen came forward with a whole lot of others to come to Christ. The work in Maintown and Town West still continues today. Work that is being done by ordinary people who love God and love others. The lesson for me that I learned and that I've seen is, and it's a reminder to us all, we are all sent, no matter who we are, or what we do, or where we are. God uses us in our families, in our neighbourhoods, in our workplaces, in our communities, and sometimes even in our churches too. Bless you.